Here's the truth. Emotional immaturity is not about malice. It's about avoidance. And it doesn't just hurt, it erodes trust, safety, and intimacy at the root. We're not here to shame, we're here to name. Because once we name it, we can choose something better. Avoids accountability. This is the classic pattern. Blame others, deflect, deny, or rewrite history. When mistakes happen or feelings get hurt, instead of stepping into the discomfort and owning their part, emotionally immature men often find ways to shift the focus away from themselves. Maybe it's blaming you, maybe it's minimizing what happened, or sometimes it's just straight up denial. Whatever form it takes, the message underneath is clear. I'm not vulnerable enough to admit I was wrong. At the heart of this behavior is a fragile sense of self-worth that can't bear the weight of shame. When I started studying vulnerability and shame, I saw how powerful and paralyzing the fear of being flawed can be. People who avoid accountability often aren't trying to be difficult on purpose. They're protecting themselves from the messy human act of saying, I messed up. They want connection, but their coping mechanism is to shield their ego rather than risk the vulnerability needed for true intimacy. This creates a painful cycle. You raise a concern, hoping for honesty and growth, and instead you meet defensiveness or silence. You're left feeling unseen and questioning yourself. Am I overreacting? Is this my fault? That self-doubt only feeds the shame the other person is trying to avoid. It's exhausting and isolating. Research shows that people highly sensitive to shame are more likely to avoid accountability as a defense mechanism. It's not stubbornness or indifference, it's fear. But here's the truth. Accountability isn't about perfection. It's about courage. The courage to say, I'm not proud of this, but I want to make it right. And that courage is the foundation of trust and connection. When accountability is missing, relationships suffer. But with it, love grows stronger. Uses anger to mask vulnerability. Instead of saying, I'm hurt, they say you're too sensitive. Instead of crying, they yell or shut down completely. This isn't strength. It's emotional camouflage. It's a way to hide the parts of themselves that feel fragile, exposed, or uncertain. It's really going on underneath that anger is fear of being seen as weak or not enough. When you grow up believing that vulnerability equals danger, anger becomes the default shield. It's louder, it's more acceptable, and it keeps people at a distance. But anger isn't the problem. It's what anger is covering up that matters. I've spent a lot of time exploring how we protect ourselves from vulnerability. And what I've learned is that anger is often the first line of defense when someone feels emotionally unsafe. It's easier to be mad at someone else than to sit with your own pain. But this defense comes at a cost. When anger replaces honesty about feelings, connection suffers. It's also important to recognize how confusing this can be for the people on the receiving end. You're not just dealing with the anger, you're trying to understand what's beneath it. You want closeness, but instead you get distance wrapped in intensity. It leaves you wondering if you caused it or if something is wrong with you. Research shows that many people who struggle to express vulnerability have learned early on that it's too risky. They don't lack emotions. They lack safe ways to share them. Emotional maturity means learning to sit with discomfort without needing to hide behind anger. The courage to say, I'm hurt, instead of you're too sensitive, opens the door to real connection. That's where healing begins. Struggles with consistency. He says he'll call, doesn't. He opens up, then vanishes. This isn't random. It's often a self-protection strategy, staying close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to avoid emotional exposure. It's like standing on the edge of a pool, dipping a toe in, but never fully diving. Consistency is one of those things that feels simple on the surface, but it's actually a powerful measure of emotional maturity. It says, I'm here, you can count on me. But when someone struggles with it, it creates uncertainty. You start wondering if what you experienced was real or just a momentary glimpse. Why does this happen? A lot of it traces back to early experiences where emotional safety was unreliable. If you grew up in a place where people were unpredictable, sometimes present, sometimes distant, your nervous system learned to brace for inconsistency. As adults, that pattern doesn't magically disappear. It shows up in how you relate, the push and pull, the hot and cold, the hesitation to fully engage. That push-pull dynamic can be painful for everyone involved. It leaves the other person in limbo, guessing, doubting. Is this the real him? Will he stay? Can I trust this? Trust isn't built on uncertainty. It's built on reliable presence over time, even when it's messy or imperfect. But here's the hopeful part. Consistency is a muscle, and like any muscle, it can be strengthened. It starts with small acts of showing up, keeping promises, being present even when it's uncomfortable. It's saying, I'm here even if I don't have all the answers. That willingness to be consistent, to be present even when it's hard, that's where emotional maturity lives, and that's where connection grows. Emotionally withholds his punishment. You upset him, now he's silent. Now he's distant. This isn't emotional maturity, it's control through detachment. And often it's subconscious, but it still hurts like hell. When someone uses silence or withdrawal as a weapon, it's a form of emotional distancing that's painful and confusing. It leaves the other person feeling rejected, abandoned, and desperate for connection. The thing is, this behavior usually isn't about the other person at all. It's about the person withdrawing, trying to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed or vulnerable. They don't know how to express their discomfort or hurt, so instead they shut down emotionally. What's heartbreaking about this pattern is that it creates a toxic cycle. The person who feels hurt by the silence reaches out, trying to bridge the gap, but the silence just grows heavier. The distance becomes a punishment, a way to teach a lesson, but it doesn't teach anything except how to feel unsafe in the relationship. Psychologists call this behavior a form of emotional manipulation, even if it's unintentional. It's a defense mechanism that comes from fear of intimacy, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as weak. But the cost is high. Trust erodes, connection fractures, and resentment builds. The antidote to this isn't more silence. It's vulnerability. It's the courage to say, I'm upset and I need space, but I'm still here with you. That kind of honesty invites connection instead of shutting it down. And it's a mark of emotional maturity that, once cultivated, can transform relationships from battlegrounds into safe spaces. Emotional withholding as punishment is painful, but it can be unlearned. It starts with awareness and a willingness to break the silence with truth. Because in the end, connection depends on presence, not absence. Lacks empathy for others' emotional experience. Empathy is feeling with someone, not fixing, not judging, but truly being present to their pain or joy. Emotional immaturity shuts that down. Instead of tuning in, they might say, you're overreacting, or that's not a big deal. Those words aren't just dismissive, they're a signal that they're emotionally unavailable in that moment. What's important to understand is that this lack of empathy isn't about being cruel or uncaring. It's often rooted in a limited emotional vocabulary and a deep discomfort with feelings, both their own and others. When someone hasn't learned how to sit with difficult emotions safely, the natural response is to minimize or avoid them altogether. This response can be confusing and painful for the person sharing. When your feelings are dismissed, you start questioning yourself. Am I too sensitive? Is this really worth feeling? That self-doubt chips away at your confidence and your sense of being seen and understood. And when someone you care about consistently fails to empathize, it creates a distance that's hard to bridge. Research in emotional development shows that empathy requires vulnerability and emotional regulation, skills that take time and practice to build. When those skills are missing or underdeveloped, Empathy can feel like an overwhelming task, even threatening. So instead of opening up, emotionally immature men might close off or change the subject. But empathy is a practice, a willingness to lean in and say, I hear you. I see your pain. It doesn't mean fixing or solving. It means being with. That willingness is a cornerstone of emotional maturity, and it's what builds true connection. Without empathy, relationships become lonely places. With it, they become safe harbors. Reacts defensively to feedback, even gentle, loving feedback can provoke a storm, deflection, sarcasm, or flat-out denial. Why? Because they experience correction as rejection. That sting, that hit to their sense of self feels unbearable, so the immediate impulse is to protect themselves rather than listen. It's easy to mistake defensiveness as stubbornness or arrogance, but it's often much deeper than that. When someone reacts this way, it's usually because their self-worth is fragile and they don't have the emotional tools to tolerate discomfort without shutting down or pushing back. Research shows that people with low distress tolerance, meaning they struggle to stay present when they feel criticized, are more likely to respond with defensiveness, even if the feedback is meant to help. This defensive reaction creates a challenging dynamic. The person offering feedback can feel rejected, unheard, or even unsafe to be honest again. Meanwhile, the one receiving the feedback may feel attacked and misunderstood, reinforcing their fear of vulnerability. It's a cycle that keeps growing, making genuine connection harder and harder. But emotional maturity means learning to sit with that discomfort, to hear feedback without feeling diminished or disrespected. It's about understanding that correction doesn't equal rejection, and that growth often begins in those hard moments. Being willing to say, thank you for telling me, instead of you're wrong, opens the door to real change and deeper trust. So while defensiveness can feel like armor, it often hides a profound vulnerability, a fear of being seen as less than enough. Recognizing this is the first step toward breaking the pattern and building healthier, more honest relationships. Seeks escape over resolution. Conflict arises and suddenly he's gone, physically or emotionally. Hard conversation, he's busy, distracted, or disappears altogether. This avoidance isn't about being indifferent, it's a protective mechanism, a way to dodge discomfort and vulnerability. But avoiding the hard stuff doesn't make it go away. It just piles up beneath the surface, waiting to erupt later. What's tricky here is that running away from conflict is often misread as strength or independence, but real strength lies in leaning into discomfort, in staying present when things get messy. Avoidance leaves relationships stuck in limbo, where problems aren't solved, feelings aren't expressed, and connection can't deepen. From a psychological perspective, this escape behavior is tied to fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, or fear of emotional overwhelm. When someone isn't equipped with the emotional tools to regulate those fears, the impulse to run is almost reflexive. It's easier to check out than to risk feeling vulnerable. But here's the truth: relationships grow through conflict, not despite it. The willingness to stay, to listen, to engage in difficult conversations is an act of courage and emotional maturity. It's about saying, I value this connection enough to face the discomfort. When escape becomes the go-to move, it leaves the other person feeling abandoned and invalidated. It creates a silent barrier that's hard to break down. Healing begins when both people choose presence over avoidance, curiosity over fear, because at the end of the day, connection requires staying, even when it's hard, needs constant validation but offers none. This isn't about healthy self-confidence. It's about a fragile sense of self that constantly seeks external approval to feel okay. He needs praise, reassurance, admiration, but rarely offers the same back. This emotional imbalance creates a one-sided dance where one person is always reaching out and the other is always taking in. This need for constant validation often comes from a place of deep insecurity. When someone doesn't have a strong internal compass for their worth, they look outward to fill that void. But here's the catch. Validation is a two-way street. When it flows only one way, it creates emotional asymmetry. That imbalance can be exhausting and lonely. Psychologically, this pattern reflects unhealed wounds and self-worth struggles. It's not about narcissism, though it might look like it on the surface. Instead, it's about a person who hasn't learned to nurture their own value and depends on others to do it for them. That dependency, however, isn't sustainable, and it often leaves relationships feeling strained and unbalanced. The painful truth is that when someone is always seeking but never giving validation, it can feel like love is conditional or transactional. The person on the receiving end might start to wonder if their worth is only recognized when they serve the other's needs. True emotional maturity involves developing an internal sense of worth and learning to both give and receive validation generously. It means being able to say, I see you, you matter, without needing anything in return. That kind of mutual respect and appreciation is what builds strong, lasting bonds. Validation is not just a gift, it's the language of connection. Without it, relationships can't thrive. Here's intimacy beyond physical connection. It's a common misconception that emotional immaturity looks like distance or coldness across the board, but often it shows up as being physically close while emotionally distant. Emotionally immature men might be sexually available but emotionally absent. They confuse closeness with control, thinking that keeping people at a safe distance emotionally is the way to protect themselves from being hurt or seen as vulnerable. This fear of true intimacy isn't about a lack of desire for connection. It's about a deep-seated worry that if they let someone in fully, they might be rejected or exposed in ways that feel unsafe. Emotional intimacy requires vulnerability, the willingness to share fears, dreams, and imperfections. But for many, vulnerability wasn't modeled as a safe or acceptable way to be. So instead, they build walls or keep the relationship on a surface level. This pattern creates a painful paradox. The desire for connection is there, but the ability to fully engage emotionally is blocked by fear. They might show love through actions or physical touch, but avoid conversations about feelings or fears. The person on the receiving end often feels confused, craving deeper connection while facing emotional distance. Learning to move beyond this fear requires courage and practice. Emotional intimacy is not about losing control. It's about gaining trust in oneself and the other person. It's about saying, I'm willing to be seen, even if it's uncomfortable. True closeness isn't just physical. It's a brave act of letting someone into the parts of ourselves we usually hide. That's where real connection lives. Struggles to name or regulate emotions. Ask him how he feels, and you often get, I'm fine, or I don't know. This isn't just about avoiding a conversation or being closed off. It's about a fundamental difficulty in identifying and understanding emotions. Emotional vocabulary wasn't built, and without those words, feelings become confusing or overwhelming. Emotional immaturity isn't just poor communication. It's about undeveloped inner awareness. When someone can't name their emotions, it's much harder for them to regulate those feelings or express them in healthy ways. They might lash out, withdraw, or shut down because the experience of feeling is too uncomfortable or unknown. The inability to put feelings into words creates a barrier to connection, not only with others, but with themselves. This struggle often comes from how emotions were handled during childhood. If vulnerability or emotional expression was discouraged or punished, the skill to recognize and process emotions didn't develop fully. Instead, emotional experiences were pushed aside, ignored, or masked. Developing emotional literacy is a cornerstone of emotional maturity. It means learning the language of feelings and practicing self-awareness. When you can say, I'm feeling anxious or I'm hurt, you gain power over your experience instead of being controlled by it. It's important to remember that emotional regulation isn't about being perfect or always calm. It's about understanding what's happening inside and responding with compassion and clarity. When emotionally immature men begin to build this awareness, it opens the door to healthier relationships and deeper self-acceptance. Because ultimately, naming our emotions is the first step toward owning them, and that's where true growth begins. As we've explored together, emotional immaturity isn't about flaws or failures. It's about the challenges we all face in navigating vulnerability, connection, and growth. Recognizing these behaviors is the first courageous step toward change, not just for the men who exhibit them, but for everyone who loves, supports, or is affected by them. Emotional maturity is a journey, one that requires patience, compassion, and above all, the willingness to show up honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. It's in leaning into that discomfort, owning our stories, and choosing connection over avoidance that transformation happens.